Hello class, this is Dr. Carl Letamendi, and this video lecture is an overview of the Chapter 2 PowerPoint presentation from the Leading with Cultural Intelligence text by Mai Moua. Again, as I mentioned in the first video for Chapter 1, none of the content was produced by me, so all credit is due to the author of the book. And this chapter is called Understanding Culture. So this presentation here is a little longer than the other one, so I'm going to try to get it as short as possible. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to contact me. So here we're talking about cultural systems, and cultural systems, as defined by the text, is the grouping of a culture's rituals, traditions, ceremonies, myths, and symbols. Okay, so those are all components of a cultural system: rituals, traditions, ceremonies, myths, and symbols. Some cultural anthropologists, and anthropologists are people who study humans, essentially. Some cultural anthropologists would describe the cultural system as a macro culture, which is a large cultural system. So just to give you an example of that, Catholicism is a culture that's not bound by geography, right? It's not, there's no the Catholic country, it's just a Catholic culture that transcends cultural, geographic boundaries. And then a microculture is a smaller unit of culture, which is often referred to as a subculture. So these are some of the elements of culture. You have culture is learned, it's shared, it's dynamic, it's systemic, and it's also symbolic. So to elaborate a little bit on the learned part, according to Gert Hofstede, culture consists of mental programs, and mental programs are an individual's patterns of thinking, feeling, and potential acting that may have been learned throughout his or her lifetime. And these are referred to as softwares of the mind and mental models. The patterns of culture binds us together and enable us to get along with each other. Within teams and organizations, in-group blind spots can lead to groupthink. So then, groupthink is when people just buy in because others are. And as defined by the text, groupthink is a group dynamic in which the pattern of thinking conforms to the group's values. And that's the key word there, conformity. This explains the ways in which groups ignore alternative solutions and take on actions and behaviors that discount the experience for others. Culture is dynamic. Culture is dynamic and complex. It is fluid rather than static, which means that culture changes all the time, every day, in subtle and tangible ways. So we have in the social sciences what's called systems theory. And systems are interrelated, interconnected parts that essentially create a whole, or a whole narrative or a whole picture. To address the system, one must be able to address the underlying patterns. And understanding the thoughts help leaders to recognize that yearly gender sensitivity training would never work. And what is meant by that is that if you just do it once a year, it's probably not going to work because you might need it more often for other cultures, right? Because not everyone perceives gender in the same way. Culture symbolic. Symbols are verbal and nonverbal representations that link human beings to each other. Because the meaning attached to symbols is arbitrary, different interpretations of a symbol can occur in different cultural contexts. And this happens a lot in the Hispanic culture, for example, because you can even go down further into the level of different countries, and it's amazing how maybe like one word can mean different things to all of the different countries within the Latin America. Or for example, we may cook the same dish, right? But we call it different things in different countries. Stereotypes and generalizations. Stereotypes are statements and interpretations which are usually negative that are made about a group of people which limit that group to specific perspectives. And in the workplace, it's hard to break through stereotypes because people normally have, depending on how exposed they've been to these stereotypes throughout their lives, they have developed like a preconceived um, hypothesis of what certain people are going to behave like or act like. So in the workplace, sometimes you'll find that we do code switching, which also, switches us into what we identify as that appropriate workplace behavior that everyone expects us to have. Generalizations are broad statements, either valid or faulty, that are based on facts, experiences, examples, or even logic. There's different levels of culture. National culture are the values, largely unconscious and developed throughout childhood, that are held by a majority of the population within a nation. A regional subculture is a subgroup of a national culture in which the characteristics of that subgroup are distinguished from those of another subgroup. And organizational culture is a culture that is specific and unique to an organization, making that organization distinctive from competitors and non-competitors. Right? So we've taken it from culture at the national level to now the essence of the course, right? Which is the organizational culture, like within the workplace here, or anywhere for that matter. And team culture are the values, beliefs, and norms of culture exhibited on a team level. So I've experienced differences in team culture when I used to work for a company. I'm not going to name the company in Miramar, and we had very different departments, and some departments were apparently more fun than others. So it was very evident that there was an imbalance in across the teams. Some teams were had very strict supervisors, others were very relaxed. Um, so that's just one example of variations in team culture within an organization. Individual culture are individual differences that relate to an individual's preferences for things based on culture and personal experiences, including the influence of family, peers, school, media, coworkers, and geographic region. Culture has roots, and these roots are manifested by values. Values are principles that guide individuals in their behaviors and actions. Assumptions are also part of these roots, and assumptions are beliefs and ideas that individuals believe and hold to be true. We also have symbols as roots of culture. So here we have the five cultural value dimensions, right? We have identity, power, gender, uncertainty, and time. So and these are the things that vary across cultures, right? So when we're talking about identity, on one extreme we have group, and then on the other end of that spectrum we have individual. So what this means is, it's just a variation between a collectivist society or an individualistic society, right? Do you make your decisions as part of a larger group or as a family, or do you say screw everyone else, I make decisions on my own? So that's kind of like what the spectrum looks like on both ends. The second value dimension is power. So on one extreme you have the egalitarian, and then on the opposite side you have the hierarchical. Then you have gender. On one side you have feminine, and then on the other side you have masculine, right? Because you have very masculine dominated cultures, and then you have very feminine directed cultures as well. Uncertainty is another value dimension. On one side you have ambiguity, and then on the opposite you have structure. And the last value dimension is time. And on one extreme you have relationship, and on the other you have task. So then this is basically, um, within maybe even the organizational setting, you have the relationship focused organizations or the task based organizations. Identity is defined as a cultural value dimension that refers to the attention of groups or individuals towards group needs versus individual needs, as well as towards individual achievement and interpersonal relationships. So this is just kind of that spectrum that I was talking about, the individualistic or the collectivist, and this is what that spectrum looks like. So some cultures, for example, maybe, oh, what did I do? So these are the slides that I'm probably just gonna zip through. Okay. So let me get the pen here and get back to what I was talking about. So, for example, a culture can be more heavily emphasized on the individual needs. So maybe they're right here, right? And basically, what this translates to is more personal needs as opposed to group or family needs. An individualistic culture is a type of culture that places importance on decision making, conflict resolution, and negotiation based on individual preferences rather than group needs, personal disclosure, and individual achievements and needs. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the collectivist culture, which is the group focused culture. And that's the type of culture that places importance on decision making, conflict resolution, and negotiation based on group needs rather than individual preferences, doing things for the group rather than for oneself, a lack of personal disclosure, group public image in social context, and maintaining relationships. Power is defined as a cultural value dimension that refers to the strict rules that establish the types of relationships individuals have with one another. So here is an example of a power value dimension. Here you have um, inequality on one side and then egalitarian on the other. You have Susan here, closer to the egalitarian. And then here you have the laissez-faire, which means let it be, leave it alone, right? Kind of power value dimension. And then on the other side, you have the authoritative, right? Gender represents two paradigms of thinking and practice about the world in relation to traditional values associated with gender roles. A masculine culture tends to emphasize ambition, control, competition, assertiveness, and achievement, whereas a feminine culture emphasizes nature, care, sharing, quality of life, and relationships. So here is what some spectrum of gender dimensions looks like. On one side you have cooperation, and then on the other you have competition. On one side you have modesty, and then on the opposite side you have assertiveness. Uncertainty is a cultural value dimension emphasizing cultures are either oriented towards uncertainty or towards creating certainty and stability. So here are some examples. On one side you have ambiguity, and then on the other you have certainty, which essentially translates to flexibility and structure. Time. A cultural value dimension that speaks to how communities are oriented to space and time, including their tendencies towards traditions and the past, and their orientation towards the future and the present. So here are some examples of the time value dimension. You have traditions and past on one side, and then current or future on the opposite. And then here you have the task focus, and on the other side you have the relationship focus. Global leadership and organizational behavior effectiveness, or GLOBE, as you may see it abbreviated, is an international group of researchers and social scientists who study multicultural value dimensions, especially how those dimensions are expressed in different cultures. So these are some of the cultural dimensions that have been researched by the GLOBE study. Here we have uncertainty avoidance, power distance, institutional collectivism, in-group collectivism, and gender egalitarianism. So here, just like we did with the previous slide, you have, with one of the previous slides, you have on one extreme, you have, for example, the need for established social norms, rituals, and practices, and then on the opposite, you have comfort with ambiguity and predictability. You can read this on your own. This table is actually in the text too, so it would be helpful. And to you, if you read chapter 2 and picked up on some of the more in-depth examples that the text provides. Here's a couple more. So assertiveness, future orientation, performance orientation, and humane orientation. If I recall correctly, I read the book a while ago. There are some examples of different countries and where they stand. So it'd be interesting to see if the country that you're from would fall if you agree with what you're seeing. So please make sure to mention that in the discussions. It'd be fascinating. So to give you an example, assertiveness on one extreme is assertive, confrontational, and aggressive in social relationships, and then on the other is you have people, cultures who are timid, submissive, and tender in social relationships. So if you're finding as you're reading this that you know you're one or the other, just recognize that at the opposite extreme, there are people who are at that side too. So like for example, if you feel like you are timid and submissive and you could never be assertive and confrontational, the opposite is that there might be some people who are looking at this and saying, yeah, this is me. This is definitely not me. So that's what all this is about. Managing cultural diversity is being able to recognize that you're going to have both of these in your organization. So it's all about how you maximize usage of these characteristics, all of these cultural characteristics, to make your organization a better place for everyone. So here's some more examples. You can read that from your text. So here are a list of desirable and undesirable leadership attributes from the Globe research. Some desirable leadership attributes are that you're trustworthy, right? As a leader, people have to be able to trust you. Being just is being fair, right? Honesty, having foresight, planning ahead, encouraging, being positive and dynamic. Okay, so that's according to this Globe study that are desirable leaderships. And this is coming from the entity that's researching cultures all across the board. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking that these are all characteristics that everybody wants in leaders, not just from certain cultures, but all across the board. So it's interesting to see that there are similarities in what people want in a leader, regardless of what culture you're from. And there are some undesirable leadership attributes: being a loner, being asocial, non cooperative, irritable, non explicit, egocentric, ruthless, and dictatorial. So don't be those things. Some more desirable leadership attributes are that you're motivational, that you build confidence, that you're intelligent, dependable, a team builder, and also a communicator. And not that I'm a part of this Globe research study, but I would also add that you have the ability to inspire as the last one. So motivation is great. Usually, if you can motivate people, you're getting them towards a certain goal. Inspired people don't require motivation because they're inspired to do it on their own. So I think that's also a desirable leadership characteristic. And this concludes our video presentation of Chapter 2, Understanding Culture, from the Leading with Cultural Intelligence text by Mai Moua. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to send me a text or email me, and I'll be more than happy to help. Have a great day.